In these videos we're going to talk about working with our inverse functions a little bit more. In the textbook you can look to page 443 and 447 amongst others for help with this information. Right, so we'll review from working with the inverse trigs for sine. Right, that if we want to explain the solution for each of these, right, so here it's telling us that this is the value. Okay, well, we know, right, we know that the output of the inverse sine of some ratio has to fall between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. As this input is between negative pi and pi over 2, right, this input falls between these values, so that means that the output of this, where the inverse undoes the function, is going to be the same piece. Okay, so because pi over 8 is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, right, because this is true, then this function just undoes this function because they're inverses. Okay. How is that different from what we have over here? Well, over here, the inverse sine of the sine of 5 pi over 8 is 3 pi over 8. Well, why would that be? Well, let's look at this visually. Right? Visually, 5 pi over 8 is in this quadrant right over here. Okay? That's the quadrant where I am right over there, and I know that my reference angle is 3 pi over 8. Okay? That's my reference angle for this angle in this quadrant. However, 5 pi over 8 is greater than pi over 2. So therefore, not in the range of our inverse sine. So we must be with the inverse sine between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, which implies it's going to be this reference angle for us, which is 3 pi over 8. Okay? With cosine, it's going to be a bit different. With cosine, the output of the inverse cosine function is between 0 and pi. Right? Well, pi over 8 is between 0 and pi, so the inverse cosine simply undoes the cosine, and that's what I'm left with. That is not the case here. For this situation, we have 9 pi over 8. Right? If I consider 9 pi over 8, 9 pi over 8 is just a little bit past pi, with the reference angle of pi over 8. Right? As we have that 9 pi over 8 is greater than pi, therefore it is not in the range of the inverse cosine of x. So instead, I have to use some other angle that's going to have the same ratio. Well, cosine is negative here, but guess what? Cosine is also negative there. So, reference angle of pi over 8. So what's going to be the output? The output will be 7 pi over 8. Okay? We have to recognize how that works. Okay? Let's check another one out. Here's 9 pi over 8. What do I know? This is very, very important. My inverse sine must be between negative pi over 2, and pi over 2 for my outputs. 9 pi over 8 does not satisfy that. So, I have to say, where is 9 pi over 8? 9 pi over 8 is right over here. What's the reference angle? Pi over 8. But I need an angle that's between here and here with that same reference angle. What's that reference angle going to be? The reference angle is still going to be pi over 8, but it's going to be an angle going down, so it's going to be negative pi over 8. Right? And that is because 9 pi over 8 is not in the range of the inverse sine of x. So therefore, it has to be something that is in the range, which is negative pi over 8. Right? And once again, up here for this one, we would have to have 7 pi over 8. Okay. We can do this work in degrees as well, and some people may find it easier one versus another, but we just need to be familiar with both. Okay. The inverse cosine of the cosine of 200. Right? What do we know about the output, the range of the inverse cosine? Inverse cosine must be between 0 and pi, which means that the inverse cosine must be between 0 degrees and 180 degrees. 200 degrees is not in that interval. So I have to consider where 200 degrees is. 200 degrees is over here with the reference angle of 20 degrees. So I have to consider some other angle measure that's going to have the same cosine ratio as 200. That would be a second quadrant angle with the reference angle of 20 degrees, and that's where I have 160 degrees. Alright, so once again, 200 degrees is not in the range of the inverse cosine, so therefore it has to be some other angle that has the same reference angle and the same positive or negative ratio, and in that case 160 degrees. Okay, so think through those last couple, and you can verify each of them using your calculator. So to show you how to do that right quick, right, so I'll come over here. Here I'm working in degrees, so I'm going to go mode to degrees. Okay, and I'm going to say, well, what is the inverse cosine of the cosine of 200? Right? And the inverse cosine of the cosine of 200 is 160. We see that. We were in degrees there. Okay. What if I was over here in radians? Then I want to go to mode to radians. Okay, so mode into radians. And I'm going to have second sine for the inverse sine of the sine alpha y equals 9 pi over 8. Okay, and I'll press enter, and notice I get this negative 0.39. Okay, if I say negative alpha y equals pi over 8, notice that I get that same value. So that's what we mean by verify each using your calculator. All right, so go ahead, verify them with your calculator, and attempt those last couple. I know they all say B. I just forgot to change that lettering. Okay, make sure you're getting your practice. Ask questions for clarification when needed.